Thanks so much for joining today's webinar on the topic of US embryos and other human cells and tissues being transported to the United States for surrogacy. So let's jump directly into it here. Perfect. All right, so today's host of this webinar is me, Edwin. I'm the International Manager here at Hatch and PFCLA, and also a two-time father through surrogacy and egg donation. I'm sure if you've seen some of these other webinars, you're getting tired of that a little bit. I'm always presenting that part, but it's important to know that we are an agency filled with intended parents, previous surrogates, etc., very eager to share our own experiences, the good and the bad, throughout the journey. So we'll let you know in the end how you can connect with us if you want to. All right, today's schedule, a short introduction. We're going to talk a little bit about Hatch and PFCLA very briefly so you know who we are. And then we're going to talk about navigating these regulations and requirements for importation of human cells and tissues into the US for surrogacy. So screening for risk factors, for example, is one important part, testing for infectious diseases, registration with the FDA, we'll talk about that, and any exemptions that might exist from these FDA regulations. We'll also briefly touch upon the subject of actually shipping human cells and tissue in terms of time and costs after we've established what it takes first to qualify for doing that in the first place. And then we'll have a Q&A if there's any questions on that. All right, shortly about Hatch and PFCLA. Hatch and PFCLA are actually long-term partners for a very, very long time. And today what we do is that we offer in-house partnerships, basically. So Hatch and PFCLA have worked very closely together to create like a one seamless experience for the whole surrogacy and egg donation, if applicable, and IVF journey, instead of kind of keeping it all fragmented in different parts. So we offer an experience where there's one team, a seamless journey from agency to clinic. We do that for a fixed fee program. So given that we have both sides in-house, we can really include all of these things that are necessary for going on an adventure like this, but also kind of keeping you going, right? Including these worst case high risk scenarios, which might not occur, but that are nice to be protected for when they do occur. So we built that into our peace of mind programs. And it also means that we have in-house doctors, which is amazing in terms of being able to do some of these steps of the medical screenings before we actually accept our donors and surrogates. We're talking like things like pre-match donor medical record screening and a pre-match surrogate medical record screening, uterus lining checks, etc. Just ensuring that we're on top of things before the match, so there's less hassle of going back with the rematch or doing any of that additional work, which might slow down the process. So we do everything on medical on the Hatch side and everything medical on the IVF clinical side, of course, with PFCLA, including egg donor and surrogate on the agency side, of course, legal, insurance, and all the coordination that this journey takes. And then all of the medical stuff, the gooey stuff at the clinic there, the eggs and embryos, creating those and that beautiful process. So that's a little bit about that. We do have some amazing numbers here. We're one of the first surrogacy agencies in the United States and the first egg donor agency to exist. So it's been an amazing 33 years, 3,300 happy, healthy births. And we work with clients from all over the country. A significant portion of our business is actually international clients coming to us from different countries, pursuing surrogacy for medical reasons. We have an amazing success rate, looks at, when you leave this program, do you have a baby or not, which we're happy to see that so many of our clients do. We work with amazing attorneys. They're not in-house. We want them to be your independent legal representation, but we do cover for fees for those attorneys, and we have a hand-curated list with the best surrogacy attorneys in the country for you to utilize. And then once again, we have our doctors in-house, which is an amazing deal. So that's something that we're really excited about sharing more about in the future. All right, so shooting ahead here. All right, let's see, navigating the regulations and requirements for this field. So the requirements for human cells and tissues used in gestational surrogacy are regulated by the FDA. So for the ones of you who might be international, don't know what the FDA is, the US Food and Drug Administration regulates the human cells and tissue that are used with the intention of being implanted or transplanted, infused, whatever you want to call it, into a human recipient into the US. So we have to follow these FDA regulations, and according to them, any clinic or lab needs to assess the donor eligibility before moving forward with retrieving or handling human cells and tissues. So what does that actually mean then? It means mainly three things. It calls for screening for risk factors, testing for infectious diseases, and also the clinic's registration with the FDA and how they list those human cells and tissue. So these are this is what needs to be done before there's any considerations about importing such human cells and tissues for surrogacy in the US. So let's break them down a little bit and look at them step by step. So the screening for risk factors, that really aims to minimizing the risk of spreading communicable diseases, right? So you're having, one person provide the eggs, for example, or semen, and that will inevitably be transferred into a surrogate in the future then. And there's a risk of that being transmitted, basically spreading that infectious disease, etc. So that's one of the most important things. It involves a physical examination. It also involves a medical records review for the donor, be it donor eggs or donor sperm. And it must be performed within 6 months before recovering human cells and tissues, where there is variations for that a little bit, depending on if we're talking eggs or semen, etc. But this part has to be done before that stage or within that time. And the physical examination, I think, makes sense. The medical records review looks more for if there's any lifestyle behaviors surrounding drugs or sex, etc., that might pose an issue or increase the risk of spreading those communicable diseases. So that's what the medical records review does for that donor. So that's the screening for the risk factors. Testing for infectious diseases then is a bit different. So here, it's more specific on what do you want to test for, right? So there's a couple of tests that need to be done, HIV type 1 and 2, hepatitis B and C virus, syphilis, chlamydia, and gonorrhea. So this is kind of universal. Egg donor or sperm donor, all the same. If it is a sperm donor, there's actually additional tests that need to be taken to what is listed there, which is HTLV virus type 1 and 2, and CMV. These are our abbreviations. Apologies for that. It takes a lot of space to write out these medical terms, but I think you'll find it very easily if you do a bit of Googling on that. But this is also kind of the base of the FDA testing for infectious diseases. So this will need to be done. So your clinic would very likely know these tests if you would mention them. So this is the test that needs to be carried out. A lot of people are under the impression as long as these tests are done, then everything is fine and we can do this kind of exportation, importation for surrogacy. That's not the case. And that has to do with all of these three steps having to be completed. So even if the testing alone can be done, it doesn't mean that other requirements are fulfilled, which is an important distinction. Exactly. So just to be very clear, this is incorrect, that misconception that the tests alone qualify for the use of such human cells and tissue. I understand that it might seem very easy to translate these tests into any local test and just have it done. But once again, there's other requirements on top of these. So what are other requirements on top of these then? Well, the test has to be FDA licensed, approved, or cleared by the FDA. So once again, the tests alone, even if you can perform them, are those tests FDA licensed, approved, or cleared? International clinics are very unlikely to have access to those kind of tests. So that's something that has to be taken into account. And not only does it have to be licensed or approved or cleared, it must also be carried out in the accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. So the actual test has to be licensed, approved, and cleared by the FDA, and then exactly those instructions must be followed. And there is this opportunity of having FDA kits sent internationally to clinics local, but there are still other important factors which we will look at. The time of the testing, for example, in relation to the donation is important. So the test alone does once again not qualify for that. And there's differences for the sperm donor versus the egg donor. So we'll explore this a little bit more, what this actually means. Even with the shipment of the FDA kits, for example, there's other requirements in place as well. So this is just to kind of give a little bit of more information of, this incorrectness of thinking that we can do this just because of these tests are done, hoping that this will give a broader perspective on what also is the issue of doing this somewhere else than in the US with a FDA certified clinic. And that brings us into the third kind of portion of that, which is the registration with the FDA. So The FDA requires establishments to be registered with them. So even if you've gone through the first step, you've gone through the second step, if this is missing, there's still an issue there, right? The establishment must also list all of their human cells and tissues within 5 days of commencing operations. So it's very important that registration, all of that builds into the understanding of the actual requirements. Those registrations must be renewed annually. Sorry for the typo there. The establishment must also ensure that the testing required is done at a CLIA certified lab or equivalent. So, I hope at this stage for you who are thinking about this really see the kind of complexity of this. It's not about the simple test. There are also specific instructions on how to maintain the records and label these human cells and tissues. So this all comes on top of everything else, basically. So somebody that's, with the US clinic, it's very likely that this is all in place already, but it's good to ask. But with international clinics, it's very different. So if you are an international intended parent, and obviously moving from within the US is a bit different, but from abroad, especially, need to keep to tabs on all of these 3 steps to even have a chance of having these regulations fulfilled before considering this. So this needs to be considered very early before going ahead with freezing eggs, creating embryos, or freezing semen. Please do check up on these 3 things because it all needs to be in place to even be able to say yes from a clinic's perspective in the US. And you can actually search for such registered establishments on the FDA website. So if you're wondering, is there any clinic in my country that does this? Have a search and see there if there's anything that exists. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's just can be translated into a successful process overall. There's good reasons to come to the US for these procedures, but you might be one of the lucky ones where one of the few occasions when there are FDA registered and licensed labs abroad